When I woke up to Karen's bulldozer destroying my great-grandfather's 130-year-old barn, I thought my family's history was gone forever. But after she stole my mountain spring to feed her fancy lakefront resort, she had no idea I controlled the upstream water source that kept her business alive. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The sound of heavy machinery woke me up at 6 a.m. on what should have been a peaceful Saturday morning. I stumbled out of my cabin, coffee mug in hand, and couldn't believe what I was seeing. A massive yellow bulldozer was tearing down my great-grandfather's barn. My name is Tom Wheeler, and I own 200 acres of pristine mountain land in northern Montana. The property has been in my family since 1889, when my great-grandfather built the original homestead and barn with logs he cut himself. That barn had survived blizzards, floods, and over a century of mountain weather. But it couldn't survive Karen Morrison. Karen had bought the old Riverside Resort 6 months ago, a fancy lakefront property that sat in the valley below my mountain land. The resort was a collection of expensive cabins, a main lodge, and a private lake that wealthy city folks paid thousands to enjoy for a week. Karen was one of those wealthy city folks who decided to make the mountains her permanent playground. "Hey!" I shouted, running toward the bulldozer. "Stop. What are you doing?" The bulldozer operator, a local guy named Pete who looked thoroughly uncomfortable, shut off the engine. "Tom, I'm real sorry about this," Pete called down. "Mrs. Morrison has a court order. She says the barn is on her property." "What court order?" "That barn is a quarter-mile up the mountain from her resort." Pete climbed down and handed me a folded paper. She showed me this. "Says the property line runs right through where the barn sits." I unfolded the document, my hands shaking with rage. It was an official-looking survey report claiming that my family's barn had been built on what was now Karen's property. The signature at the bottom belonged to Morrison Land Services, Karen's own company. "Pete, this is garbage. My family's deed clearly shows the property line runs along the creek bed, not up the mountain." "I don't know about all that legal stuff, Tom. I just know Mrs. Morrison is paying me good money to clear this barn, and she's got paperwork that looks official." That's when Karen herself appeared, stepping out of a brand new Range Rover like she owned the entire mountain. She was dressed in expensive hiking gear that had probably never seen an actual hike, with perfectly styled blonde hair and makeup that must have taken an hour. "Good morning, Mr. Wheeler," she called out sweetly. "I see you've discovered our little property improvement project." "Property improvement? You're destroying my great-grandfather's barn." Karen's smile never wavered. "Actually, according to our professional survey, that barn is on my property. It's been an illegal structure for over a century. I'm simply correcting a historical mistake." I stared at her in disbelief. "Historical mistake? My family built that barn in 1889. And they built it in the wrong place. Honestly, I'm doing you a favor by removing it. The structure was an eyesore that was hurting both our property values." "Karen, that barn is clearly on my side of the creek. The property line follows the water." "Oh, that old creek line? That's not accurate anymore. Waterways shift over time, you know. Our survey used modern GPS technology to establish the true boundaries." She pulled out her phone and showed me what looked like a professional survey map. The property line had indeed been moved, cutting a chunk out of my land that included not just the barn, but also the natural spring that fed the creek running down to her resort. "This is fraudulent," I said. "You can't just redraw property lines because you want more land." Karen's expression turned cold. "Mr. Wheeler, I have legal documents, professional surveys, and a court order." "What do you have?" "Some old papers from the 1800s. I have the legal deed to this property, which you're welcome to challenge in court. But until then, this barn is coming down. Pete, continue with the demolition." "Wait," I said desperately. "At least let me remove some of the historic materials. That barn has hand-hewn beams that are over 130 years old." Karen pretended to consider this. "I suppose you could salvage some materials? But you have exactly 1 hour before we resume demolition. I have a schedule to keep." I spent the next hour frantically trying to save what I could from my family's barn. The hand-carved beams my great-grandfather had shaped with an adze. The iron hardware he'd forged himself. The wooden hay loft where my grandfather had played as a child. But there was too much history and not enough time. When the hour was up, Karen waved her hand like a queen dismissing a servant. "Time's up, Mr. Wheeler. Pete, finish the job." I stood helplessly as the bulldozer destroyed 130 years of family history. Each beam that cracked, each board that splintered felt like a piece of my heart being torn away. But Karen wasn't done with her cruelty. "Oh, and Mr. Wheeler? I should mention that the spring up there is also on my property now. I'll be installing a fence next week to prevent any trespassing. The spring. The natural spring that had fed our family's water supply for generations. The same spring that created the creek running down to Karen's resort lake. You can't fence off a natural spring. Actually, I can. It's on my property, which means it's my water. I'm planning to drill a proper well and pipe the spring water directly to the resort. Much more efficient than letting it run wild down the mountain. That night, I sat in my cabin surrounded by the salvaged pieces of my great-grandfather's barn and tried to figure out what to do. Karen's fake survey was convincing enough to fool a local contractor, and challenging it in court would take months and cost thousands of dollars I didn't have. But as I studied the real property documents, I realized Karen had made a crucial mistake. She was so focused on stealing my barn and spring that she hadn't bothered to check who owned the land upstream from the spring. That land belonged to my neighbor, Bill Hawkins, an old-timer who'd been fighting his own battles with Karen's resort expansion. More importantly, Bill controlled the main stream that fed my spring, which fed the creek, which fed Karen's precious resort lake. The next morning, I drove up to Bill's cabin with a bottle of bourbon and a proposal. She did what? Bill exploded when I told him about the barn. That woman has been trying to buy my land for months, making all kinds of threats about easements and water rights. Bill, I've been thinking. What if Karen's resort suddenly had water problems? Bill's weathered face broke into a slow grin. What kind of water problems are we talking about? I spread out a topographical map on his kitchen table. The main stream runs across your property before it hits my spring. If something were to redirect that stream, Karen's resort lake would start dropping pretty quickly. And her fancy guests wouldn't be too happy about swimming in a mud puddle. Exactly. The resort's whole appeal is that crystal-clear mountain lake. Bill studied the map carefully. You know, I've been meaning to dig a new irrigation pond for my cattle. Might need to redirect some water flow to fill it. That's perfectly legal, right? A man has the right to use water on his own property. Absolutely. Montana water law is very clear about that. We shook hands over the bourbon, and I knew Karen Morrison was about to learn a valuable lesson about upstream consequences. Bill had 50 years of experience with heavy equipment and mountain engineering. More importantly, he had every legal right to modify water flow on his own property. We spent the next week carefully planning our water management project. Bill would dig a large irrigation pond about half a mile upstream from my spring. To fill the pond, he'd need to redirect the main stream using a series of channels and temporary dams. The beauty of the plan was its complete legality. Bill needed irrigation water for his cattle operation. The fact that redirecting the stream would cut off Karen's resort lake was just an unfortunate side effect. On Monday morning, Bill fired up his excavator and began digging. The first sign that our plan was working came on Wednesday. I was repairing fence posts when I heard shouting from the direction of Karen's resort. Through binoculars, I could see people standing around the lake, pointing at something. By Thursday, the lake level had dropped enough that the resort's boat dock was sitting on dry ground. Friday brought Karen herself, storming up the mountain in her Range Rover like an angry hornet. "What did you do to my lake?" she screamed before she'd even gotten out of the vehicle. "I'm sorry, what about your lake?" "The water level has dropped 4 feet in 3 days. My guests are demanding refunds because they can't use the boats." I looked genuinely puzzled. "That's strange. Have you had any unusual rainfall patterns? Sometimes seasonal changes can affect water levels." "Don't play dumb with me. You did something to the stream." "Karen, I haven't touched any stream. That barn demolition of yours broke my heart, but I'm not the type to seek revenge." "Then why is my lake disappearing?" I scratched my head thoughtfully. "Well, lakes are fed by streams and springs, right? Maybe you should check upstream to see if anything's changed." Karen's face turned red. "Upstream? You mean that crazy old man's property? Bill Hawkins? He's not crazy, just private. But he might know something about water flow changes." Karen stomped back to her Range Rover and roared off toward Bill's place. 20 minutes later, I heard even more shouting from that direction. That evening, Bill called me with an update. "She's madder than a wet cat," he chuckled. "Came roaring up here demanding I fix her lake, immediately." "What did you tell her?" "I showed her my new irrigation pond. Told her I needed the water for my cattle operation, which is the truth. She threatened to sue me, so I reminded her that Montana water law gives property owners the right to reasonable use of water on their land." "How reasonable is your use?" "Well, I've got 30 head of cattle that get mighty thirsty. Figured they need about 50,000 gallons a day during the summer months." I whistled. That's a lot of thirsty cattle. Yep. And the pond needs to be full to ensure a reliable supply. Might take a month or two to get it properly filled. A month or two. Karen's resort bookings were solid through the summer, with guests paying premium prices for lakefront activities. Without the lake, she'd face massive cancellations and refund demands. The weekend brought a parade of expensive vehicles to Karen's resort as word spread about the lake problem. I watched through binoculars as groups of disappointed guests loaded their gear and drove away. Monday morning brought a new visitor to my cabin, a man in an expensive suit driving a Tesla. Mr. Wheeler? I'm attorney James Blackwood. I represent Ms. Morrison in her business interests. What can I do for you, Mr. Blackwood? My client believes you're responsible for the water shortage affecting her resort property. Your client believes a lot of things that aren't true, like thinking she owned my family's barn. The attorney shifted uncomfortably. That's actually part of why I'm here. Ms. Morrison is prepared to discuss a settlement regarding the barn demolition. What kind of settlement? She's willing to pay you $10,000 for the materials lost in the demolition, plus she'll correct the property line survey to reflect the original boundaries. I almost laughed. And in exchange? She'd like your assistance in resolving the water flow issue. Mr. Blackwood, I don't control any water flow. If Ms. Morrison has concerns about her water supply, she should speak with whoever does control it. We believe that would be your neighbor, Mr. Hawkins. Bill's a private man. He doesn't care much for lawyers or people who bulldoze historic barns. The attorney looked frustrated. What would it take to get Mr. Hawkins to restore the water flow? I pretended to think about it. Well, Bill's pretty upset about the barn too. He's been talking about how it was a landmark he'd been seeing for 50 years. He might be more cooperative if Ms. Morrison showed some respect for local history. What kind of respect? Maybe she could rebuild the barn. Exactly as it was, with the original materials I managed to save. Attorney Blackwood's eyes widened. Rebuild an entire barn? That could cost $50,000 or more. Historic reconstruction is expensive. But I bet Bill would appreciate the gesture. The attorney left without making any commitments, but I could see him calculating the cost of rebuilding versus the cost of losing a full season of resort bookings. Tuesday brought Karen herself, but this time she wasn't shouting. She looked tired, stressed, and desperate. Tom, we need to talk. What about Karen? I think we got off on the wrong foot. Maybe I was hasty about the barn situation. Hasty? You bulldozed 130 years of family history based on a fake survey. The survey wasn't fake. It was just incomplete. I'm willing to admit there might have been some boundary confusion. I could see the defeat in her eyes. Her precious resort was hemorrhaging money with every day the lake level dropped. Karen, that barn represented 4 generations of my family's life on this mountain. You destroyed it like it was garbage. I know, and I'm sorry. What would it take to make this right? Rebuild it? Exactly as it was. That's impossible. The materials, the craftsmanship, it would cost a fortune. I saved about 60% of the original beams and hardware. A good craftsman could use those to reconstruct the barn authentically. Karen was quiet for a long moment, staring up the mountain where her bulldozer had erased my family's history. If I rebuild your barn, will you help me with my water problem? Karen, I've told you repeatedly, I don't control any water. But I might be able to talk to Bill about his irrigation needs. How long would it take to rebuild the barn? With the right crew and budget? Maybe 6 weeks. Karen closed her eyes, probably calculating the cost of 6 weeks without lake revenue versus the cost of reconstruction. Fine. I'll rebuild your barn. But I need the water restored immediately. I'll talk to Bill. That evening, I walked up to Bill's place to discuss Karen's offer. She wants to rebuild the barn? Bill asked, impressed despite himself. Exactly as it was, using the original materials. Bill nodded slowly. Your great-grandfather was a master craftsman. That barn was a work of art. So you'd consider adjusting your irrigation schedule? Well, I suppose my cattle could drink from the old watering holes for a while. And the pond is getting pretty full already. How long would it take to restore the creek flow? I could start releasing water tomorrow. Take about a week to get the lake back to normal levels. We shook hands on the deal and I called Karen with the good news. The next morning, Bill began carefully dismantling his temporary dams. Water started flowing back down the mountain toward Karen's resort. Karen, meanwhile, hired the best traditional craftsman she could find to rebuild my barn. The crew leader, an old Norwegian immigrant named Eric, examined my salvaged materials with obvious respect. These beams, they are cut with hand tools, he said reverently. Your great-grandfather, he knew his craft. Can you rebuild it exactly as it was? Better than new but looking exactly like old. This kind of work, it is my specialty. Over the next 6 weeks, I watched my great-grandfather's barn rise again on the mountainside. Eric and his crew used traditional joinery techniques, hand-forged hardware, and careful attention to every detail. The craftsmanship was beautiful, but the cost was brutal. I later learned that Karen had paid nearly $80,000 for the reconstruction, more than her resort made in a typical month. But the barn wasn't her only expense. The week without water had cost her dozens of bookings and thousands in refunds. Her insurance company had denied her claim, citing acts of nature exemptions. And the negative reviews from disappointed guests had damaged her resort's reputation. When the barn was finally complete, Eric invited both Karen and me to the traditional topping out ceremony. In my country, when we finish a barn, we celebrate with the neighbors, he explained. It brings good luck. Karen looked exhausted but relieved as we admired the reconstructed barn. It was identical to the original in every way, from the hand-hewn beams to the wooden pegs that held it together. It's beautiful, she admitted quietly. I can see why it meant so much to your family. My great-grandfather would be proud, I said. And grateful that you chose to rebuild rather than just pay damages. Karen was quiet for a long moment. Tom, I owe you an apology. I came here thinking I could just take whatever I wanted because I had money and lawyers. I didn't understand what I was destroying. The mountains have a way of teaching those lessons. I've learned that the hard way. The resort business is tougher than I thought, especially when you make enemies of your neighbors. Over the following months, Karen and I developed an unexpected friendship. She'd learned to appreciate the mountain's history and natural beauty instead of trying to control it. Her resort guests now received tours that included the story of the reconstructed barn and the importance of respecting local heritage. Bill, meanwhile, had used his temporary irrigation pond to create a beautiful wildlife habitat. Eagles and deer now gathered there daily, and he'd started giving his own nature tours to interested visitors. The experience had taught us all valuable lessons. Karen learned that money and lawyers can't overcome mountain justice. Bill learned that sometimes cooperation serves everyone better than conflict. And I learned that some things, once destroyed, can be rebuilt even stronger than before. But the most important lesson was about consequences. Karen had thought she could bulldoze my barn without any repercussions. She'd assumed that her money and fake survey would be enough to steal my family's land and water. She'd forgotten that mountains are connected. That water flows downhill. That upstream neighbors remember when they've been wronged. In the end, Karen's greed cost her nearly $100,000, weeks of lost revenue, and a permanently damaged reputation. But it also gave her something valuable, a rebuilt barn that stood as a monument to the truth that every action has consequences, and every stream has a source. And sometimes, when you bulldoze someone's history, you might find your own future flowing away like water down a mountain.